In the palace courtyard, beneath columns polished by 100 years of incense, a woman is dragged into the light. Soldiers close ranks. A hush falls like a shroud. She is not brought for a crime of the city or a debt to the state. She is brought because someone in the palace has decided she should be punished for refusing the king. What happens when a system trains a man to think of himself as more than human, and of everyone else as less? What happens when refusal becomes an insult punishable by spectacle? This is the question that radiates out from one of the darkest episodes attributed to Xerxes, the Achaemenid king remembered in Greek memory as the architect of vast palaces and failed wars. The story we will follow is drawn largely from a single Greek historian, and it sits at the uneasy intersection of power, ritual, and vengeance. It is a tale not only of individual cruelty, but of a court whose routines and structures made such cruelty thinkable, even inevitable. Xerxes came to the throne in 486 BCE, inheriting an empire whose scale was meant to impress and to intimidate. The rituals that surrounded him were not mere formality, they were instruments of rule. Proskinesis, the act of prostration and ritual obeisance, required those who approached the king to lower themselves in a way that sharply distinguished ruler from ruled. In that system, the king did not simply command, he was made into a figure apart. Surrounded by attendants whose lives depended on pleasing him, an environment where speech could be measured as treason, a king could slowly be conditioned to expect unquestioning submission. Atassa, Xerxes' mother and a figure of real authority in the court, helped shape that environment. As queen mother, she occupied a space that was both protective and political. Her place reinforced not only the sanctity of the king's person, but also the logic of the palace. Proximity to the sovereign meant access, and denial of access could be used as power. The message was subtle and total. Some people belong to the center, others are outside of human consideration. We should be precise about terms. The Anderun, the Persian royal household, was not a simple harem in the popular sense. It was a complex political institution. Within its walls, luxury and confinement walked hand in hand. Daily rituals, eunuchs who policed movement, and the sealed quarters of royal women all created a system where freedom of action was conditioned by rank and favor. Women at court could exercise influence, but that influence was conditional, always bounded by the sovereign's pleasure. Power inside the palace existed because the king allowed it. That dependency transformed interpersonal dynamics into political currency. When we speak of the most notorious episode connected to Xerxes' private life, we must first step into the historian's terrain.
Herodotus, a Greek writing decades after the events he narrates, preserves an account that has captured imaginations for centuries. He writes with an agenda and a cultural distance. Greek eyes were fascinated and repelled by Persian customs, and their telling often served Greek moral or political purposes. Persian royal inscriptions, by contrast, speak of conquest and order and are silent about palace scandals. That silence is no proof that nothing happened. It is a reminder that the sources we have are partial, shaped by audiences and intentions. According to Herodotus, this is what transpired. Mesistes, a member of the royal family and brother to Xerxes, had an unnamed wife in the court. She refused to comply with Xerxes' advances, a refusal that, in a court where refusal could be read as an affront to the person of the king, was dangerous. The story continues that Xerxes then became involved with Mesistes' daughter, Artante, sometimes spelled Artante in other renderings, a turn of events that would form the pivot of scandal. When the queen, Amastres, learned that the king had slept with Artante, she did not attack Artante directly. Instead, she engineered a humiliating and brutal reprisal, one recorded by Herodotus as both a personal act of vengeance and a public demonstration of power. A brief content warning before the account that follows. What is described in the sources is violent and disfiguring. I will report the ancient narrative soberly and without sensationalism. Herodotus reports that Amastres used the king's obligation to grant requests at a festival to set her plan in motion. During a royal celebration, she asked Xerxes to fulfill a favor, a request the king, by ritual and custom, felt compelled to grant. Herodotus tells us that Amastres requested the handover of Mesistes' wife, who was then delivered to the queen's attendants. What follows in his narrative is a deliberate act of mutilation, a punishment inflicted not primarily to kill but to mark, to send a message. Herodotus lists severe disfigurements, injuries intended to strip the woman of social standing and physical integrity, and then returns her to Mesistes, a living condemnation. The deed, in the Greek account, was meant as revenge for the perceived insult to the queen's honor. It is crucial to underline the historian's caution here. This version of events comes to us through Greek narrative lenses, and interpretation has long been contested. Some scholars read the episode as a literal report of palace violence. Others see in it elements of moralizing fiction, a Greek dramatization meant to expose Persian decadence. Archaeological records and Persian texts do not corroborate the specifics. Still, the story matters because it reveals how contemporaries and later generations constructed a picture of imperial authority, ruthless, theatrical, and capable of turning private affront into public ritual.
The mutilation, whether exactly as Herodotus describes it or as a distorted echo, tells us something about the use of power as spectacle. Punishment in that court was a demonstration. It taught observers where sovereignty began and where human claim ended. When a queen could orchestrate the public humiliation of a family member, the court's mechanisms for controlling reputation, marriage alliances, and loyalty were being exercised with surgical cruelty. The palace itself was a theater. Its punishments were the stagecraft that kept subjects in line. Violence did not stop at scandal. Mecistes, enraged and dishonored, took up arms and attempted to flee, seeking to gather forces against the king. Herodotus notes that his revolt failed and that the royal response was merciless. Mecistes' line was hunted down and eliminated. The family's destruction served as the final seal on the message that defiance, even from royal blood, would end in extinction. It was an act of intimidation that reinforced the system's boundaries. Public displays of punishment dovetailed with private secrecy to form a continuum of control. What do we make, then, of Xerxes himself? He is often seen in Greek memory as the expansive war king, a grand builder and a commander who suffered humiliation in Greece. But within the palace, his reign had another character. The rituals that surrounded him, ceremonial obeisances, the enforced separation of those who ruled from those who served, could erode the ordinary capacities for empathy. When a life is constantly mirrored back at you as obligatory reverence, the human anchor that says, "This is another person like me," can atrophy. Combined with the court's incentives for flattery and conspiracy, the role of king risked reshaping identity into an office that expected submission and bestowed deference as a right. After the disasters of the Greek campaigns, Xerxes withdrew more and more into the Underun. There, surrounded by the palace's interior life, rumor and paranoia grew. Power became a nest of factions: senior courtiers, eunuchs, the queen mother, commanders of the guard. Into that climate stepped Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard, whose influence and ambition made him a pivotal figure. Around 465 BCE, palace intrigue reached its fatal conclusion. Artabanus plotted against Xerxes and succeeded in killing him. Herodotus and other ancient commentators sketch a sequence of manipulations. Princes were implicated, fraternal murders were engineered, and the royal house turned on itself. Whether the motivations of Artabanus were personal, political, or both, his success underscored a grim truth. The very mechanisms that had concentrated power at the center also made the center brittle and vulnerable to internal violence. The assassination did not dismantle the system. Xerxes' death simply became another moment in the continuity of palace logic. His successor, Artaxerxes, would inherit not only territory, but institutions that normalized impunity for those at the apex. The spectacle of punishment and the secrecy around the sovereign's person continued to produce cycles of vengeance and suppression. The court proved adept at reproducing itself. The norms of absolute authority and dehumanizing ritual were passed on through precedence and survival. We should step back for a moment and ask, why does this episode persist in our historical imagination? Partly because it crystallizes a pattern. Absolute power, when combined with ritualized deference, dresses cruelty in legitimacy. Ritual and etiquette can turn domination into duty. What might otherwise be understood as a private vice becomes, in the context of palace structures, a political act. Violence transforms social relations, and the message of mutilation is not only to the victim, but to every observer. Your body, your name, your family can be instrumentalized to enforce loyalty. There is also a performative logic at work. Public displays of violence serve as cautionary theater. When punishment is visible and dramatic, it communicates more efficiently than secret sanctions. The palace's punishments were designed to demonstrate the cost of perceived disrespect or disobedience, to make a spectacle that would deter others. But such spectacles have a corrosive effect. They dehumanize both victim and spectator. Witnessing violence where the sovereign's will is absolute trains subjects to internalize the ruler's superiority. It trains power holders to see people as instruments. This dynamic has psychological consequences. The imperial environment encourages a feedback loop. Courtiers flatter and magnify the sovereign's grandeur. The sovereign receives fewer corrections and more adulation. The sovereign begins to believe the adulation is truth. Isolation becomes both physical and cognitive. Empathy, the capacity to see others as fully human, requires contact and truthful reflection. A system that filters both leads easily to a self-image of divinity. We do not need to posit supernatural conviction to understand the effect. Social reinforcement can create a secular sense of being above reproach. We must return here to source criticism. Herodotus is our primary storyteller for this episode. He was writing for a Greek audience with its own expectations and prejudices. Greeks admired Persian wealth and administrative skill, even as they criticized Persian customs. They had reasons to craft narratives that highlighted the moral dangers of Eastern despotism. Persian royal inscriptions, which are explicitly propagandistic in their own way, offer no parallel tale. Silence is a common royal strategy. That contrast does not disprove every story Herodotus tells, but it cautions us against taking the text at face value. Where archaeological or inscriptional evidence exists, historians cross-check. Where it does not, we mark our uncertainties.
So what do historians actually accept as likely? Scholars generally agree that the royal household centralized power and that court ritual distinguished ruler from ruled. It is also plausible that personal rivalries and family quarrels could escalate into violence. Dynastic politics in antiquity were dangerous. Whether the exact mutilation story occurred as Herodotus reports, or whether it was amplified for Greek readers, remains debated. The meaningful point is that Herodotus's account, real or partially constructed, reflects a widespread perception about Persian kingship, that it could be absolute and theatrical, and that absoluteness could be wielded in intimate and brutal ways. Beyond historical debate, the episode functions as a cautionary tale. Systems that place any person beyond accountability create perverse incentives. Absolute authority corrodes the social checks that sustain humane behavior. Ritualized reverence can calcify into a belief in personal inviolability. The palace, as a metaphor, stands for every institution where hierarchy and secrecy make grievances invisible and punishment performative. When power is shielded from consequence, cruelty can be normalized and repeated. There is another human dimension we must never forget: the experiences of those who found themselves on the receiving end of such power. Historical narratives often focus on kings and assassins. Victims are reduced to footnotes. The story of Macistes's unnamed life is, in that sense, emblematic of many erased figures in history. Her identity is not preserved beyond the scandal. She is registered only through injury. Respectful history tries to restore some measure of dignity by naming the structures that made her vulnerable and by refusing to reduce her to spectacle. The aim is not to replay violence for effect, but to understand how it was produced and what it meant for those who suffered it. This episode also invites reflection about the afterlives of stories. Herodotus's tale shaped later perceptions of Xerxes and of Persian kingship more broadly. It entered Greek moral discourse as an example of despotism, and later filtered into classical and modern imaginations. The narrative became a mirror in which Greeks and later Europeans could read lessons about governance and morality. When we consume such stories today, we inherit not only the events, but the interpretive frames that came with them. Critical reading asks us to separate the kernel of historical occurrence from the moral and cultural embellishments layered onto it. There is a final, urgent lesson for our time. The Palace of Antiquity is a useful image not because the architectural details map onto modern institutions, but because the logic of dehumanization does. Where systems concentrate power and limit external accountability, where rituals or norms prevent ordinary correction, the risk of cruelty increases.
We see echoes in modern scenarios where whistleblowers are punished, where hierarchical cultures reward silence, and where spectacle substitutes for justice. The ancient story warns that unchecked power creates incentives for abuse, and that spectatorship alone, watching but not intervening, can be complicit. To close, what does it mean to say that what Xerxes did to his own daughters or to his own household was worse than death? The phrase insists on the value of social standing, bodily integrity, and the capacity to live within community. In a certain moral economy, to be robbed of personhood, publicly stripped of agency, dignity, and kinship, can be a fate more devastating than physical death. When a system can inflict such damage with impunity, it is revealing its deepest moral failure. We must not leave this story as a morbid curiosity. It is a prompt to examine how institutions shape behavior, to insist on accountability where power converges, to remember those whom history often forgets, to question narratives that make cruelty seem inevitable rather than constructed. If this investigation has drawn you in and you want more deep historical inquiries like this one, please consider subscribing and check the description for source notes and further reading. Above all, reflect on where in our own time and place the palaces of authority still function with secrecy and spectacle, and what it would take to make them answerable to the people they govern. Names and spellings and sources vary. Xerxes, Atossa, Amestris, Mesistes, Artainti, sometimes Artante, Artabanus, and scholars continue to debate details and interpretations. Our main narrative comes from Herodotus, with Persian inscriptions remaining largely silent on this scandal. The silence is itself a historical record, not of what did not happen, but of what rulers chose not to write. What the episode leaves us with is less a neat moral than a charge. Systems that strip people of dignity produce cruelty. Systems that habitually excuse the powerful invite catastrophe. And stories preserved in the margins of ancient texts demand that we listen, critically and compassionately, to what they are still trying to teach us. If this account moved you, share it with someone who cares about power in history, and leave your thoughts below. How do we guard empathy where power is strongest? Check the notes for sources and further reading, and consider this an invitation to keep asking difficult questions about the past and its lessons for the present.